welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a topic that kind of bumps right up against the edges of what we know, near-death experiences, NDEs.
Yeah.
And you're someone who wants to get a real handle on these complex subjects, without getting totally bogged down.
Get the core insights fast but thoroughly.
Exactly. So our mission here is pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
We're going to pull out the key ideas from some really fascinating material. This time it's an interview with Sebastian Junger.
Oh yeah, he has quite a story himself.
He really does. A compelling NDE story. So we'll explore what happened to him and then look at what science tells us, or maybe doesn't tell us, about these, well, deeply personal and often pretty mysterious events.
Right. This is definitely territory where, personal stories meet scientific attempts to explain them. And often, the stories seem to point in directions science hasn't quite mapped out yet. Junger's experience, it gives us a really powerful way to look at that intersection.
Okay, let's dive straight into Sebastian Junger's experience then. This happened about, 4 years ago? He was 58.
Yeah, around then.
And by his own account, seemed perfectly healthy. Lifelong athlete. So this was a complete bolt from the blue.
Totally unexpected.
He was alone out at this remote cabin in Massachusetts. Crucially, no cell service.
Right. That's a key detail.
And then this sudden, just brutal abdominal pain hits him. Turned out it was a ruptured aneurysm.
In his pancreatic artery, which is apparently really dangerous.
Incredibly dangerous.
Yeah.
He said himself, they're so hard to diagnose in time.
Yeah, the odds were definitely stacked against him. Junger mentions survival rates for something like that are, frighteningly low, maybe 30%.
And that's if you get rapid medical help.
Exactly. And with a 90-minute trip to the hospital, his chances just plummet.
Wow.
That context, that stark reality, it really underscores just how significant what he experienced next actually was.
Right. So as the medical team is there, trying to get an IV line in him, Junger describes this sudden feeling like being pulled down, pulled into what he called a pit of blackness.
Yeah.
And then, incredibly, he sees his deceased father above him. But not like, a ghost exactly. More like an energy form was his term.
An energy form. Interesting phrasing.
And he said his father communicated with him telepathically, offering comfort, but also inviting him to come with me.
Saying you'd take care of him, everything would be all right.
Yeah. But Junger's reaction, it wasn't what you might expect.
No, not at all. It was a strong, almost visceral rejection, wasn't it?
Totally. He said he was horrified, desperately wanted to live. He was even yelling at the doctor, hurry up, I feel like I'm going right now.
Which really stands out. It's not that peaceful, welcoming feeling people sometimes describe. It's resistance, a powerful will to live.
Yeah.
And that tells us something important, I think. These experiences, they aren't always comforting or easy. They're complex.
And here's another really unexpected part of it all. He didn't remember this experience right away.
Oh, really?
No, it only came back to him the next morning. He was in the ICU, and a nurse just casually mentioned, wow, you almost died.
And that triggered the memory.
That simple statement. Boom. He suddenly had this vivid recollection of his father, the blackness, the whole thing.
Huh. That delayed recall is fascinating, isn't it?
It really is.
It makes you wonder how these intense experiences get, encoded and then retrieved by the brain when it's under such extreme stress.
Yeah.
Maybe the conscious processing and the actual remembering are sort of two different things neurologically in those critical moments.
Could be. So, okay, that's Junger's incredibly intense personal story. Now, let's zoom out a bit and look at the broader science of NDEs.
Right.
It's important to say this isn't just some, fringe idea anymore. NDEs are a recognized phenomenon studied scientifically.
Absolutely. People from totally different backgrounds, different cultures, they report surprisingly similar core elements when they've been close to death.
Like what?
Well, the recurring themes,
Yeah.
The feeling of being out of your body, the tunnel, seeing a bright light, sometimes encountering deceased relatives or spiritual figures.
Right, those common threads.
Exactly. These are consistent motifs reported pretty much globally, and not just recently, but throughout history. So scientists have been trying to link these subjective experiences to what's actually happening in the brain.
And there was that study fairly recently that got a lot of attention, monitoring brain activity right around the moment of death.
Yes, that one. They observed a sort of surge in brainwave activity, specifically activity linked to things like dreaming and memory recall.
Right before and right after the heart stopped.
Exactly, in that very brief window. Now, what's interesting is the type of activity. It suggests The dying brain might be perhaps replaying memories or generating dreamlike states.
Which could explain some of the vividness people report.
It could, potentially. It might account for some of it, but it doesn't seem to fully explain the really complex, structured narratives people describe, or that strong feeling of heightened awareness, of lucidity. It feels like one piece of the puzzle, but probably not the whole picture.
Which brings us to what feels like a pretty fundamental contradiction, doesn't it? Well, during these near-death states, brain function is often dropping dramatically. Sometimes it's close to total collapse.
Right, medically speaking.
Yet people report this incredibly vivid awareness. Even those out-of-body experiences where they feel like they're observing things happening around their own body. How does that work?
Yep, that is the central paradox, yeah. How can a brain that seems to be shutting down produce experiences that feel more real, more coherent, sometimes more profound than normal consciousness?
We don't really have a solid scientific answer yet.
Current explanations are, well, incomplete. There are theories, of course. Lack of oxygen hypoxia causing brain cells to misfire, leading to unusual perceptions, things like that.
But those theories struggle a bit.
They often struggle to explain the consistency, the structured nature, and especially the specific content of many NDE accounts, like seeing deceased relatives. It doesn't quite fit the random misfiring idea for many researchers.
And you mentioned before an interesting analogy. The observer effect in quantum physics. How does that connect?
Ah, right. Well, it's just an analogy, to be clear. But in quantum physics, the very act of observing a tiny particle can actually change its behavior.
Right. Measuring affects the outcome.
Exactly. It reminds us that our tools, our methods for observing and measuring reality, might fundamentally affect what we perceive, especially at the limits. So similarly, when we try to scientifically study something as subjective and slippery as consciousness, particularly in these extreme states,
Our current scientific framework might just be limited, not the right tool for the job, maybe.
it's possible. It's not saying quantum physics explains NDEs, definitely not. But it opens a way to think about the possibility that our current models, our scientific tools, might not be fully equipped to grasp the whole nature of reality and consciousness, especially at these boundary points.
Okay, so let's loop back to Junger. Despite having this incredibly powerful, seemingly non-rational experience, he remains a staunch rationalist.
Very much so. He's really clear about that. He says he doesn't find comfort in mystical explanations. He believes ultimately there has to be some kind of rational, understandable explanation for what happened to him.
Even if we don't have it yet.
Even if we don't have it yet, he acknowledges, neurochemical explanations might account for some parts of NDEs, a final burst of brain activity, maybe.
But there's one specific aspect that really gives him pause, that he finds deeply puzzling.
Yes. And it's this recurring thing, this phenomenon of people who are actually dying, seeing deceased individuals.
Right, and he notes this seems to happen across cultures, across different time periods. It's consistent.
And he makes a really sharp contrast with, say, hallucinations you might get from something like LSD.
How so?
Well, with LSD, the experiences are wildly varied, very personal, very different from one person to the next. But with the dying seeing the dead, there's this strange consistency.
That's a really crucial distinction, isn't it?
It is. Because if NDEs were just, random neural firings or chemicals washing over a failing brain, you'd expect much more chaos, much more diversity in the experiences.
Like a drug trip.
Exactly. So this consistent reporting of seeing the deceased, it's a significant anomaly. It's something that any complete explanation really needs to be able to account for.
And Junger points to his own experience again. Seeing his father wasn't some happy reunion he'd been hoping for. It was unsettling.
Unwelcome, even.
Yeah. And he also tells the story about his mother on her deathbed. She saw her deceased brother, who she'd been estranged from.
And she was disturbed by it, horrified even.
Right. So these aren't always these blissful, comforting visions that maybe fit a narrative of the brain trying to soothe itself.
Precisely. They can be unexpected, unwelcome, carry really complex emotions. Junger's mother's reaction is a powerful example. It pushes back against the simple idea that these are just wish fulfillment hallucinations the brain cooks up at the end.
And this all kind of leads to Junger's central point, the thing that really seems to stick with him.
Which is?
The fact that it seems to be only people who are actually dying who report seeing the dead in this way.
Ah, yes. People having other kinds of hallucinations or people who aren't critically ill, they don't typically report these specific kinds of visions.
Exactly. And that, he feels, is the aspect that science right now really struggles to explain. And it leads him to wonder, could there be a fundamental gap in our scientific picture, our understanding of reality, of life, death, consciousness itself?
It's a profound question to land on. Because while science can track the physiology, the brain chemistry changes during dying meticulously.
Yeah.
It doesn't currently have a really satisfactory explanation for this specific recurring phenomenon, the dying encountering the deceased.
It really raises a huge question, doesn't it?
It does. Are our current scientific models sufficient to capture the totality of human experience, especially right at that threshold between life and death? Maybe not entirely.
So let's try and bring this together then. In this deep dive, we've looked at Junger's personal story, the attempts by science to understand NDEs, brain activity studies.
Right.
But we keep circling back to these persistent experiences that don't quite fit the models, especially this phenomenon of the dying seeing the dead.
Yeah, you see this constant tension, the scientific drive to explain everything through, material processes, physical causes, versus the deeply subjective, often indescribable nature of consciousness itself and these incredibly profound experiences people have at the very end of life.
So we can map maybe some of the chemical changes?
So we've mapped some neurochemical shifts, sure. But the specific content, the consistency of these visions, like seeing specific deceased people, that remains a pretty big question mark.
Okay, so that leaves you, the listener, with something pretty significant to think about, doesn't it? Building on Junger's point, could these really consistent accounts from people near death, across cultures, throughout history, accounts of encountering those who've passed on?
Even though science doesn't have a clear explanation right now.
Right. Could that consistency hint at something more, maybe a dimension of reality or consciousness that our current science just hasn't grasped yet?
It certainly gives you a lot to mull over about the limits of our current understanding.
Definitely does. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.